James Cololton had been asked a lot of questions in his 32 years. He had been asked about cattle prices and fence lines and whether the creek on the north pasture was going to hold through another dry summer. He had been asked by his neighbor Pete whether he needed help with the barn roof, and by the Reverend Mills whether he was coming to Sunday service, and by half the town of Clearwater whether he was ever going to do something about the South 40 acres that had been sitting unworked since his father died. Nobody had ever asked him why he never married. Not directly. Not the way Nora Ellis asked it. Standing on the schoolhouse steps in the October light with her red hair loose from its pins and a book pressed against her chest. Just direct. The way a woman is direct when she has decided that the long way around is a waste of everyone's time. She had been in Clearwater for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, she had learned the names of every child in the school, reorganized the lending library, started a Tuesday reading group that had 12 members by the 3rd week, and managed to make James Colton, who had been perfectly comfortable with his life for 32 years, suddenly and inconveniently aware of everything that was missing from it. You've lived here your whole life. You have a good ranch. You're not unkind. Why did you never marry? He had 100 answers for 100 questions. He had spent 32 years answering questions. He had not prepared for this one, and what he said next he had never said to anyone. He had never even said it to himself. Nora Ellis had come to Clearwater on the September train with 2 trunks, a crate of books, and the determination of a young woman who has chosen her life deliberately, rather than had it chosen for her. She was 22 years old, the eldest daughter of a Cincinnati schoolmaster who had taught her that education was the most honest gift one person could give another. She had her father's red hair and her mother's practical mind and a laugh that arrived quickly and meant it. And she had applied for the Clearwater position because Montana was as far from Cincinnati as the map would allow, and she had decided at 22 that she wanted to know what was out there. Clearwater was a town of 300 people on the eastern slope of the Montana Valley with a general store, a church, a livery, a post office, and a one-room schoolhouse that had been without a teacher for the better part of a year. The children were behind. The parents were grateful. She arrived on a Tuesday and had the schoolroom organized by Thursday. James Colton heard about her the way he heard about most things in Clearwater, from Pete Dawson at the feed store, who reported that the new teacher was young and from back east and had already told the Henderson boy that his handwriting was improving, which was apparently the first kind thing anyone had said to the Henderson boy about his handwriting in 3 years. Chuckles. James had nodded and bought his feed and gone back to the ranch. He met her the following Sunday at church, where she was introduced to approximately the entire town in 20 minutes, and received every introduction with the same genuine attention, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually filing away what she heard. She shook his hand and said, "Mr. Colton, I hear your property runs along the creek north of the school." "It does," he said. "Is the water good?" "Clean," he said. "Runs clear through August." "Good," she said. "I've been wanting to take the older children out for a nature lesson. May I use the creek bank?" He said yes before she had finished asking. He rode home afterward with the impression of a man who has encountered something he was not expecting, and is not entirely sure what to do about it, which was, he would later understand, the beginning of everything. The nature lesson happened on a Wednesday in late September. James had not planned to be at the creek when it happened. He had planned to be checking the east fence, which needed attention, and the east fence ran approximately 200 YD from the creek bank, which meant he was not at the creek, but was close enough to hear the lesson. She was teaching them to read the land, not in the textbook sense. She had brought no textbooks. She had brought the children to the water's edge and was asking them questions. What direction does the water move? What does that tell you about the slope? Why do the cottonwoods grow here and not 50 yards to the left? What happens to this bank in spring when the melt comes down? The children were answering. Actually answering with the engaged energy of young people who have been given a problem instead of a page. Thoughtful, He stood by the east fence with his tools in his hands and listened. Walking home afterward, he thought, she teaches the way good ranchers ranch by paying attention to what's actually there. The next 6 weeks arranged themselves into a pattern he had not designed and did not examine too closely. There were legitimate reasons to pass by the schoolhouse. There were legitimate reasons to stop when he saw her on the steps or in the yard. There were legitimate reasons for the conversations that followed, which were never brief and never ended at the natural stopping point. He learned that she had 2 younger sisters and a brother, that her father was a schoolmaster who had taught her Latin for no practical reason and every reason that mattered, that she had opinions about cattle management that were more informed than most ranchers he knew. He learned that she laughed at things he said that other people found merely adequate. He had not been keeping track of any of this. He was simply noticing, the way you notice weather, not because you have decided to, but because you are paying attention to the world. And the world contains Nora Ellis. The question came on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October. He had stopped at the schoolhouse to return a book she had lent to the Henderson boy who had left it in the livery. It was a legitimate errand. He was not lingering except that she was on the steps when he arrived and she said, "Stay a minute." With the natural authority of a woman who doesn't second-guesses her own invitations, and he stayed. They talked about the Henderson boy, the first frost, the Tuesday reading group. Then there was a comfortable pause, the kind that had become familiar between them, the kind that didn't need filling. Curious, and Nora said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Ask you something personal." "Yes," he said faster than he intended. "You've lived here your whole life," she said. "You have a good ranch. You're not unkind." A tilt of the head. "Curious. Why did you never marry?" He stood at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his hands. He had been asked versions of this question for 10 years by his mother before she passed, by Pete indirectly, by the Reverend diplomatically. He had always had an answer. "Haven't found the right time. The ranch keeps me busy." None of those answers arrived. Now, what arrived instead was the truth. "I was waiting for you." The October light held them both. A hawk crossed the Montana sky. Nora Ellis looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Something between surprise and the calm of a person hearing something they had been waiting to hear, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she smiled. He nodded. He walked to his horse. He rode back to the ranch and went inside and stood in the kitchen for a long time without doing anything. She went inside after he left and stood in the schoolroom with both hands flat on her desk. She had expected him to deflect. Everyone deflected. He hadn't deflected. She didn't know what to do with a man who didn't deflect. 3 days after the steps, Nora was at her desk correcting arithmetic when the letter arrived, brought out from town by Pete Dawson's wife, who had been at the post office and knew Nora was expecting word from home. She read it at her desk after the children had gone. Her father was sick, not critically. Her mother was careful about that, but not well. A bad autumn cold settled in his chest and not clearing. He was 61 years old with the stubbornness of a man who believed rest was for people who hadn't finished their work, which meant he wasn't resting, which meant the cold was lasting longer than it should. Her mother's letter was 3 pages. The last paragraph said, "I am not asking you to come home. I am only telling you so you know." Which was, Nora understood, her mother asking her to come home. She folded the letter carefully. She looked at the schoolroom, the books, the children's drawings on the wall, the arithmetic she had been correcting. She thought about a train ticket and the distance and what the school would do without her for 2 weeks. She thought about a man standing at the bottom of steps saying something he hadn't planned and not taking it back. She had not yet said anything in return. She had smiled and he had nodded and they had talked about something else and he had left and she had gone inside and stood with her hands on her desk. She folded her mother's letter and put it in her pocket and walked across town to the one person in Clearwater she wanted to tell. She didn't examine why. She just walked, Before we go on, I want to stop for just a moment. From the United States to Australia, from Canada to the United Kingdom, from Ireland to New Zealand, wherever you are, thank you for riding along. If this story is giving you a good evening, a like means more than you know. And now, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. I want to know where this voice is reaching now. Let's get back because James Colton is about to do something he hadn't planned. She found him at the ranch, which she had never visited before, which meant she had walked past the school, past the church, past the north end of town, and along the road to the creek and up to the gate of the Colton property. A 20-minute walk that she had apparently done without stopping to reconsider. He was on the porch when she came through the gate. He saw her face before she said a word. "What happened?" he said. She told him about the letter. He listened completely without interrupting, without filling the silence with reassurance she hadn't asked for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "When would you need to leave?" he said. "As soon as I can arrange it," she said. "But the school Ruth Dawson's oldest daughter taught here for a season before you came. She could manage 2 weeks." "You don't have to arrange my life," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm arranging the part that's practical so you can focus on the part that isn't." He looked at her directly. "Your father is sick. You should go." She was quiet. "Come with me," she said. It came out differently than she had intended. Less practical, more direct. She didn't take it back. "To Cincinnati," she said. "I think it would help to have someone." She stopped. "I think I would like to have someone." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had asked the question nobody asked, who walked 20 minutes to his gate with a letter in her pocket and said, "Come with me," without the long way around. "And I have to stop here for a second," Bob Ashford said in the quiet between the words, "because this is the moment I always come back to, not the declaration on the steps." This one, her asking, that took more than his answer did. Remember that? He said the only thing there was to say, "Tell me when the train leaves." They left on a Friday morning on the eastbound train from Clearwater Station. James had been on a train twice in his life and had found it loud and confining both times. He was prepared to find it loud and confining again. What he had not prepared for was what happened somewhere in Nebraska on the first day. He had been careful his whole life about what he said. Careful the way a man is careful, when he has learned that words have weight and weight has consequences. On the ranch, there was always something requiring attention. The cattle, the fences, the weather, and that attention gave a man somewhere to put his mind. On the train, there was nothing to do but look at the landscape and talk. And somewhere in Nebraska, James understood that he had made a mistake. Not a terrible one, a structural one. He had spent 32 years being careful about what he said. And on this train, something kept making him say the true thing instead. He didn't know how to stop. She was telling him about a book she had assigned the Henderson boy, the one she thought would help him feel less alone. And he said, "I read that book 12 years ago, February. Worst winter on record." She looked at him. "That's the one you'd read when you were re-only." "That's the one I'd read when I needed to know I wasn't alone in being lonely." He said. Pause. She was quiet for a moment. "That's why I assigned it to Thomas," she said. "Assigned it to Thomas." He looked at the Nebraska landscape going past the window. Flat, pale, nothing like Montana, and understood that she had just told him something about herself she hadn't put into words. He filed it carefully the way he filed things that mattered. The book sat between them on the seat for the rest of the afternoon. Neither of them moved it. Neither of them mentioned it again, but it was there. The Ellis house was on a tree-lined street 3 blocks from the school where her father had taught for 30 years. James walked through Cincinnati with the awareness of a man who has spent his whole life under open sky and is now experiencing its absence. The streets narrower, the buildings closer, the horizon blocked at every turn. Nora's mother, Margaret, met them at the door. A small, precise woman with her daughter's red hair gone mostly silver, and the expression of a woman who has been managing a household through difficulty for 6 weeks and is relieved and assessing simultaneously. She looked at James with the careful attention of a mother, taking the measure of something unexpected. "Mr. Colton," she said. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, hat off. "I'm sorry about your husband. I hope he improves." Margaret looked at him for a moment, then come in. David Ellis was in the front parlor in a chair by the window. A tall, thin man with Nora's coloring and the frustrated energy of someone accustomed to being active, who has been told to sit still. "Who are you?" he said. "James Colton. I ranch in Clearwater. I came with Nora." David looked at his daughter. Nora looked at the floor for exactly 1 second. "He offered," she said. "I have a theme." David looked back at James. "Sit down," he said, curious. "Tell me about Montana." James sat. He told him. The land, the cattle, the creek that ran clear through August, the way the Rockies looked at first light. David listened with complete attention. Then he said, "You understand what you'd be asking her to stay for?" "Yes," James said. "The frontier is not kind to women." "No," James said. "It isn't." David looked at him steadily. "And yet?" "And yet," James said. "She came there herself. She stayed herself. She chose the position. She's not staying for me." David Ellis was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I don't suppose she is." He looked at his daughter, then back at James. "The creek runs clear through August, you said?" "Yes, sir. Good water is harder to find than people think." He picked up his esser at 6:00. James and David talked for 2 hours the first evening, and 2 more the second. And somewhere in the middle of the second evening, Margaret found James in the kitchen and poured him tea he hadn't asked for, and sat across from him at the table. "Her letters have been different since September." Margaret said, "Different how?" James said, "More present." She said like she arrived somewhere. She looked at her tea. "Nora has always been looking for the next thing since she was small. The next book, the next question, the next place." Pause. "Her letters since September sound like someone who stopped looking." James held his cup, curious. "I don't know what that means for her contract," he said carefully. "She came on a 1-year agreement." "I know," Margaret said. "That's not what I'm telling you." She looked at him with the directness of a woman who has been married to a schoolmaster for 30 years and has learned to say exactly what she means. "I'm telling you that my daughter is happy and that you should know that." He was quiet for a long moment. "She asked me why I never married," he said on the schoolhouse steps in October. Margaret waited. "I told her the truth," he said. "I was waiting for her." Margaret Ellis looked at this Montana rancher at her kitchen table. Honest face, worn hands, the stillness of a man who means what he says and knows the weight of it. "Good," she said. "Then don't waste any more time." David Ellis was better by the time they left. Not well, the chest took time, but better. Sitting up, arguing. Reading with the focused intensity of a man making up for lost weeks. He shook James's hand at the door on the morning they left and held it for a moment. "Take care of her," he said. "She takes care of herself," James said. "Considerably better than most people I know." He paused. "But yes." David looked at him with the expression of a father who has heard the right answer. Then he let go of his hand. On the platform, Margaret held Nora for a long time without speaking, then said something quietly that James couldn't hear. Nora pulled back and laughed. The real laugh. Sudden and genuine, and Margaret wiped her eyes with the practicality of a woman who doesn't particularly mind being seen. The train went west in Indiana. In the long golden afternoon, Nora said, "My mother likes you." "I know," he said. "She doesn't like most people. She told me." Nora looked at him. "What else did she tell you?" "That your letters have been different since September," he said. "More present, like you arrived somewhere." She looked at the Indiana farmland going past the window, flat and green. Nothing she like Montana. "I did," she said simply, softly. He took her hand the first time on the westbound train going through Indiana, and she held it with the naturalness of something that has found its place. They sat like that through the long, flat middle of the country, and neither of them said anything else. And the train went west, and Montana was somewhere ahead, and it was exactly where they were both going. They arrived back in Clearwater on a Tuesday morning. Thomas Henderson was at the station. He had heard the train schedule from Pete Dawson and had decided on his own initiative to be there. He handed Nora a folded piece of paper when she stepped onto the platform. She unfolded it. A page of handwriting, careful, practiced, considerably improved. At the bottom he had written, "I kept working on it." She looked at the boy. "I can see that," she said. "It's very good, Thomas. Very good, Thomas." He went red and walked away with the dignity of an 11-year-old who has done something brave and is not going to discuss it. James watched this and thought, this is what she does. She makes people believe they're worth the work. He thought about a boy in Clearwater who had kept practicing his handwriting for 2 weeks because a teacher had told him it was improving, and he thought about how far that kind of belief could carry a person. Nora went back to the school. James went back to the ranch. But something had shifted. The way it shifts when two people have sat on a train for 3 days and said the true thing repeatedly, and then held hands through Indiana, thoughtful. Not a shift that announces itself, just a new arrangement of what had always been there. He asked her in December on the steps where it had started with the first snow on the Montana mountains, and the school bell casting a long shadow across the yard. Excited, she said yes before he finished asking. They married in April of 1885. David and Margaret Ellis came from Cincinnati for the ceremony. David considerably improved, walking without difficulty, arguing with Pete Dawson about cattle prices within an hour of arriving, which Pete found alarming, and which James found exactly right. The school board deliberated about Nora continuing to teach after the wedding. Ruth Dawson organized a petition signed by 32 parents before the board had finished deliberating. The board approved. Their daughter arrived in January of 1886. They named her Alice for James's grandmother, a woman who had, by all accounts, said exactly what she thought and meant every word of it. On a spring evening that year, James came home from the north pasture to find Nora on the porch with Alice on her lap, reading aloud from the book, the one about not being alone and being lonely. Alice was too young to understand a word of it. Nora read it anyway. James came up the steps and sat beside her without saying anything. She kept reading. The Montana evening held them. The mountains, the creek running clear, the school bell visible at the end of the road, the ranch behind the house, and James Colton, who had spent 32 years waiting for something he couldn't name, sat on his porch with his wife and his daughter, and understood that the wait had been exactly the right length, not a day too long, not a day too short, exactly as long as it needed to be to arrive at this. Nora Ellis asked a question. James answered honestly. That's the whole story. Most love stories are when you get to the center of them. The part we forget is that the question has to come first, and asking it, really asking it without softening it into something safer. That's the braver half. Nora had every reason not to ask. She had been in Clearwater 6 weeks. He was a rancher she barely knew. The question was personal and direct and could have made everything awkward. She asked anyway because she had taught herself or been taught by a father who believed honesty was the most important thing you could give someone to look at, what was actually there, and name it. James had every reason not to answer honestly. He could have deflected. He had deflected for 32 years. He said the true thing instead, and it surprised him as much as it surprised her. 2 people, 1 question, 1 honest answer. From that, everything else followed.